welcome to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host, and if you're not familiar with that music signals that it's time for some weird questions with Jimmy Akin. And if you haven't heard Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin before, get ready because they got to reach a certain standard of weirdness to make it. So we got 2 good hours of weird questions coming up and more of that music to come. Jimmy Akin, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers and the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Hello, Jimmy Akin.
Hello, Cy Kellett.
Hey, I wanted to thank you for a great hour yesterday, and also because it was very, very helpful in our fundraising. And the day turned out to be just a wonderful day of fundraising and really redeemed what was looking like a pretty tough pledge drive, and it all worked out in the end. So thank you, Jimmy.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure. Happy to do it.
And thank you to everybody who picked up the phone and called or went to CatholicAnswersRadio.com and helped. It does seem like we're going to come pretty close to our goal. I mean, there's people who make promises. I'll send you a check and that kind of thing. So we're not exactly sure where we are, but after 2 days where it looked like it was pretty much out of reach, you really came through for us yesterday. So thank you. We're very, very grateful. And there was a lot of excitement in the hallways here after 2 hours on air yesterday. All right, the weird questions, Jimmy, come from all over, right? You get some of these weird questions. I guess some of them are emailed to us. And if a person has a weird question, and you can just email it to radio@catholic.com. We'll get it to Jimmy. And how have you rated these? Like, how weird are we going today? Are we?
Well, there's a variety. I don't rate them.
Okay.
If something is not really weird at all, I may move it over to a list of regular internet open forum questions. But most of them have at least some element of weirdness in them. Although our first question isn't so much weird as it is just not familiar to many people in the Western Church.
Okay. Well, we'll start there with Aaron, who asks, where does the idea of toll booths come from? And why didn't it make its way into the Western Church?
Well, I think the idea of toll booths is somehow connected to the DMV, and it didn't make it into the Western Church because the DMV is intrinsically evil.
That may be the case, but I don't think that was right at all.
No, it's what Aaron's talking about is a concept that one finds in Eastern Orthodoxy and in some other Eastern non-Catholic churches. The idea is, he refers to them as toll booths. They're also sometimes called toll houses or aerial toll houses because they're depicted as not being here on earth, but as being up in the air in the spiritual realm. And the idea is one that goes back way far. It's mentioned, for example, in St. Athanasius's book, The Life of St. Anthony the Great. And St. Anthony the Great lived in the second half of the 3rd century and the first half of the 4th century, so between like 250 and 350. And he was a desert hermit that had many mystical experiences. And in talking about his life, St. Athanasius mentions the aerial toll houses. They're also mentioned in other early patristic works, especially in Eastern Christendom. And the basic idea is that what happens, and by the way, there's a pretty good article on them on Wikipedia if you just search on aerial toll houses. But the idea is when you die, angels come and they pick you up and they escort you to God. But on the way, just like you're traveling a road, only it's in the spiritual world, you encounter certain toll houses. And in these toll houses, now here on earth, what a toll house does is it collects a toll from you. And so you have to pay a toll in order to use a particular highway. And it thus takes a toll on you, to use the term in the sense it originally came from. Well, something similar happens. People don't like paying tolls when they're driving down the highway. And so it's an unpleasant experience to have to pay a toll. And something similar happens in these aerial toll houses, only instead of a monetary payment, it's sort of a spiritual thing that happens. According to the way toll houses are envisioned, there are demons in them. And there are, biblical passages that associate demons with the atmosphere, like Lucifer is called, or Satan is called, the prince of the power of the air by St. Paul, for example.
Right.
And there are early Christian works, such as the Ascension of Isaiah, that depict the atmosphere. And this is not literally true, but this is how it's depicted. They depict the atmosphere below the first heaven as being infested with demons. And then when you get up into the first heaven, you meet angels, and you meet more and more powerful angels as you make your way up to God. But it was a common image to associate, to picture demons as living in our atmosphere. And so what happens is you go to a toll house, there is one or more demons in the toll house, and what they do is they confront you with sins you committed during life. Although in a really frightening way. Although some Eastern sources will say that if you repented of the sin, they don't know about it. It's been deleted from their memory bank. But what they want to do is frighten you and cause you anxiety and possibly even drag you down to hell. But if you love and trust God, you died in God's friendship, you're going to be able to resist this. You're not going to be super terrified. You'll be able to go through the toll house, and the angels will continue escorting you on until you reach God. And this is essentially another way of picturing purgatory, which is the process by which we are made ready for God's presence, that involves dealing with sins that we committed in life that we have been forgiven the eternal consequence of, but we still have disordered desires. Like if you loved pizza too much until your death, well, that's not a mortal sin, but you're not going to be held back in God's presence by your disordered desires. So you need to be freed from those.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what purgatory does, according to the Catechism. It frees you of any disordered attachments that you had during life. And this sort of confrontation with your sins sort of kind of does the same thing. And so there have even been Eastern sources that have said that this is the same thing as purgatory. It's just a different way of picturing it. And I should mention that this view, although it's very common in Eastern Christianity, is not universally held by like Eastern Orthodox theologians. There are some theologians who reject this view, and some who will even call it heretical, but they must be using the term heresy in a different sense than it's used in the Catholic Church. So it's not agreed to by everybody, but it is very common. And it's essentially an alternative presentation of purgatory. As to why it didn't make its way into the Western Church, or at least become a dominant view in the Western Church, well, essentially because Western Christians developed another way of picturing this process of purification before we get to God. And they commonly pictured it as an application of not of confrontation with demons, but as an application of fire to the soul. And that goes along with some imagery that St. Paul uses in 1 Corinthians, where he says our works are going to be tested by fire. Now, modern theologians in the Western Church tend to regard this fire as not literal. It's not really, because they would ask the question, how could literal fire affect a non-physical soul?
Mm-hmm.
Fire is a state of matter, it's a plasma, but the soul is not made of matter. So how could plasma affect it? And some medieval theologians came up with arguments to try to say, well, here's how I think a physical fire could affect a non-physical soul. But that view is not widely received today. And so it's generally regarded in the West that the fire imagery is based on biblical imagery, but it's not meant to be taken literally. And some theologians, including Pope Benedict XVI, have suggested that the fire actually may be a symbol of the fiery love of Christ, that he loves us so much that an encounter with his love will burn away all of our impurities, so that we will be freed from our disordered attachments and can be perfectly happy with God in heaven without being distracted by negative disordered attachments. there's an interesting question, and I've seen some sources actually talk about this. But, so I mentioned where we got the fire imagery in the West. We got it from St. Paul. But, because the afterlife is something we haven't experienced, it can be pictured in different ways. And it's something that transcends our current ability to understand, where our minds are not configured for the afterlife in this life. So it exceeds what we're actually able to understand. And there are different ways of picturing it. And there has been some discussion of, well, what might have influenced the imagery that's used in the toll houses. And one thing that occurred to me, because where St. Athanasius lived and where St. Anthony the Great lived,
I believe they were Egyptians.
that's right. They were in Egypt. And one of the things that occurred to me is that the Egyptian idea of the afterlife, the pre-Christian Egyptian idea of the afterlife, may have influenced this. I talked about this in episode 240 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, so you can go to mysterious.fm/240 to hear about it. I interviewed Egyptologist Dr. Bob Breyer, and one of the things we talked about was how the Egyptians conceived of the afterlife. Basically, they thought that the pre-Christian Egyptians thought that when you die, you have to go through a series of gates. And at each of these gates, you're confronted by monstrous beings, monstrous, godlike, demonic beings who will try to do bad things to you. But if you know the right things to say, you can get past them. And that's actually what the Egyptian Book of the Dead is. It's a record of what you're supposed to say at each of the gates that you're going to encounter, so that you can make it safely to the place of the gods. And so you have a very similar image here. You're trying to go get to be with the gods. You got to go through a series of stations. And if you do the right things at these stations, you get to be with God. And that's very similar to what we see with the toll houses. The angels are escorting you along this progression of different stations, and you've got to successfully get through the stations, which you will if you're a Christian and trust God. And then you ultimately get to be with God. And so the concept of the afterlife that the Egyptians had prior to Christianization sounds similar to the concept of the aerial toll houses. And of course, in the 200s and 300s, you still had a lot of pagans in Egypt alongside Christian Egyptians. And so it was part of their culture to think about the afterlife in this way. And that, to my mind, is a plausible explanation for where this imagery came from. I've also seen it suggested that it might be related to the Bardo Thodol, which is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but I'm skeptical of that because I've read the Bardo Thodol and it's not like this.
Yeah.
Also, there was no real contact between Tibet and Egypt in the first few centuries AD. So I think the Egyptian Book of the Dead may have influenced it, but probably not the Tibetan Book of the Dead. In any event, it's not. Presumably the afterlife is more than we can understand or can visualize, but this is one way that the post-mortem process of getting to God has been pictured in Christian tradition.
Aaron, thanks for starting us off. As Jimmy said, it's not the weirdest question, but it's certainly a very unfamiliar territory to many of us in the West. I'm very glad you brought us that question. It's Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin. More of that right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Catch Catholic Answers live anytime at Catholic.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Are you a coffee drinker? If so, you can now enjoy a coffee roasted to perfection by the Carmelite monks of Wyoming. Delicious Mystic Monk coffee is roasted and prepared by monks in a hidden cloistered monastery and is available in over 25 varieties. All Mystic Monk coffees are works of perfection and labors of love. For more information on how to purchase Mystic Monk coffee, visit mysticmonkcoffee.com. That's mysticmonkcoffee.com.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
Hosting Women Made New has helped me deepen my own faith, and I look forward to every weekend having those in-depth discussions with my guests. It's been such a blessing being a part of the EWTN family and carry on the mission that Mother Angelica started.
Women Made New, Saturday noon Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. That music sounds a little weird to you. It's because that's our Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin music, and we got more weird questions to come. Did you know that next Wednesday is National Book Lovers Day? Holy smokes! How did I not have that on my calendar? We thought that was a great reason to have one of our super awesome $10 book sales. Just visit shop.catholic.com right now and look for the $10 book sale category. 35 titles, including new books and bestsellers. Just $10 each. We've got Jimmy Akin's The Bible is a Catholic Book, my book, A Teacher of Strange Things. Just $10 each, and 33 more of those. This weekend, pick up your $10 books and prepare to fall in love again with books. That's our Book Lovers $10 book sale all weekend long at shop.catholic.com. All right, this weird question comes from Steve, and Steve got me all wrapped up in it. This is what he says, Jimmy. Scotty had a little too much to drink again and staggers down to the control room at 2 a.m. and accidentally beams up Cy. During the transport, Scotty inadvertently pushes the wrong buttons and mistakenly erases Cy's memory. Captain Kirk tells Spock to try the Vulcan mind meld, hoping they can find out some information about this confused guy with the Society 315 t-shirt. During the mind meld, Spock dies. Now, Cy thinks he's Spock. The crew decides to keep him around for entertainment purposes. Unfortunately, Cy begins worshiping Vulcan gods and then begins preaching about them and proselytizing to the crew like he's Jimmy Swaggart. Kirk has just had just about enough of this and drops him off on some planet in the Delta Quadrant where Cy lives out his days eating plants and worshiping green lava. Even though he's now worshiping lava with full knowledge and consent, it's through no fault of his own. He didn't ask to be beamed up and have his memory erased and then brainwashed into thinking he's Spock. Can he still be saved? Or is he lost in space?
So, first thing, serious points for the Lost in Space reference. In fact, even if this whole story was created just to do, is he saved or is he lost in space? Yeah. It's worth it. So that's a great reference, in particular because the original Star Trek series was on the air at the same time Lost in Space was.
Yeah.
So points for that. So here's what I can tell you in analyzing the scenario. First thing is if you become incapacitated so that you are no longer thinking in your right mind, and this could happen, for example, if you go into a coma, or you suffer a traumatic brain injury, or you have your memory erased and new memories implanted, it would qualify. You didn't do anything to bring the situation about, and consequently, you're not responsible for what happened to you. And so your soul will remain in the same state that it was in before you had this event that caused you to no longer be in your right mind. Another thing could happen. Someone could sneak up behind you and inject you with some serious hallucinogen or something like that. You're not responsible for what you do under the effects of the hallucinogen. There also was an actual case in the 19th century here in America. I'm blanking on his name, but there was a railroad worker who accidentally had a railroad spike driven through his head. And he survived, but it totally changed his personality. Before the railroad spike incident, he had been a nice, considerate person, and he became mean and abrasive afterwards. But that wasn't his fault. So he wasn't responsible for the meanness and abrasiveness he displayed to other people. And in the same way, if this scenario happens and Cy thinks he's Spock and starts proselytizing for Vulcan gods and worshiping green lava, then Sai's not responsible for that. And so the state of his soul will be the same as it was before this transporter accident mind meld fiasco. So if he was already in a state of grace, then he would continue to be in a state of grace. If he was not in a state of grace, he would continue not to be in a state of grace. Well, what about whether he'll stay that way? Well, let's assume he was in a state of grace. Are there any situations, given that he's not in his right mind, where he could end up committing a mortal sin? I think the answer to this is yes, but it won't be a mortal sin based on his previous beliefs. It will be a mortal sin based on his current beliefs. So, for example, if he thinks green lava is super holy and divine, and one day he just he decides it would be gravely sinful for me to spit on green lava, as a sign of defiance to the god of green lava. It would desecrate the green lava, kind of like stamping on the Eucharist or something. And I don't care. I know it's wrong. I know it's gravely wrong to spit on green lava, but I'm going to deliberately spit on it anyway. Well, his belief is mistaken. But if he, with full knowledge and full deliberation, decides to defy his belief and desecrate the green lava, then that would be a mortal sin, because what he's really agreeing to on the human level is, I'm willing to do an act of grave sacrilege. And it doesn't matter that he's misidentified what is actually super holy. Mm-hmm. What he's doing with his will, if he's doing it fully deliberately, is choosing to deliberately commit grave sacrilege against what he regards as supremely holy. So I think it would be possible for him to commit a mortal sin and lose the state of grace, given his current belief system. Would he then be able to return to a state of grace? And again, I think the answer is yes. If he then repents of the act of having committed grave sacrilege against what he regards as divine, and if he even if he's praying to a green lava god, if he sincerely repents of having committed grave sacrilege against the divine, and if his contrition is perfect, meaning based on the motive of love of the divine, then he would be restored to grace, because even though he's ignorant of the true God, he nevertheless is orienting his will to having love for the supreme being as he understands it. And by orienting his will to have love for the supreme being, that would restore him to a state of grace with the true God that he has mistakenly confused with the green lava.
All right.
So he could return to the state of grace.
Steve, thank you for the question, I guess. I mean, it didn't work out so good for me in the question, but thank you very much for the question.
Well, I mean, Trent I don't know if he's still doing it, but when you talk to Trent, he has a tradition of killing you off in his examples, right?
Yes, he does. And I think he took so much flack for it that now he just usually inflicts some horrible pain on me. He doesn't actually kill me.
Okay.
So,
well, that's a little nicer.
I know, we're working our way towards friendship, one step at a time. It's Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin. This one comes from an anonymous questioner. My question is, if a group of people were stranded on a deserted island like in the TV show Lost, and there was no priest among them, could a layperson declare himself a priest and perform valid sacraments? Would the validity of the sacraments be contingent on how closely this person stuck to the teaching of the church? That is, what if he had a suitcase full of Catholic books and was on his way to be ordained as a priest when the plane crashed?
Okay, so there are some follow-ups to this, but to answer that question, you can't just declare yourself a priest. It doesn't work that way. You have to be ordained. And so consequently, the only sacraments that this person could validly perform would be the ones that don't require a priest: baptism and matrimony. And so those two would be valid. He could validly baptize people, and he could validly consent to be married or witness at a marriage. But it would be only those two sacraments.
All right. So, as you said, there's some follow-ups here. If the answer is that the sacraments would be invalid, which I suspect is the case, our anonymous questioner asks, I have a couple of follow-up questions. Could the unbaptized be saved through perfect contrition?
Yes, they could be saved through perfect contrition, but they don't need to stay unbaptized because anybody can baptize you. It does not require a priest. So this seminarian you mentioned would be able to baptize people, and perfect contrition wouldn't be required.
There's at least one more follow-up, maybe more than one, but we'll do that right after this. It's Jimmy Akin. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and it's Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live. Want to get right to the core of Christ's saving message? Want a roadmap for living the life Christ calls you to? It's time to look again at the Beatitudes. In his new book, Heart of the Gospel, How the Beatitudes Show Us God's Plan for Happiness, Father Sebastian Walsh demonstrates compellingly how these 8 declarations make up the foundation, the essence, and the final goal of Jesus' teaching. Heart of the Gospel illuminates the scriptural passages from which we get the Beatitudes, explains the significance of their wording, their order, and their timing in Jesus' ministry. And it draws out edifying parallels and connections with salvation history and the lives of the saints. Most importantly, Father Walsh offers wise counsel from his own work as a priest and teacher to help you live the Beatitudes in your own life. Order your copy of Heart of the Gospel today at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Want to know more about the origins of the Catholic Church? Joe Heschmeyer explores the beginnings of Christianity. In the early church was the Catholic Church. Joe digs deep into the words and actions of those who lived right after the apostles to refute anti-Catholic claims of how the faith was lived back then. Order your copy of The Early Church Was the Catholic Church today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
If you're not a Bible scholar, the full message of how the Sunday Mass readings fit together can be tough to comprehend. Apologist Carlo Broussard is here to help. Join Carlo every Friday for the Sunday Catholic Word podcast. In each episode, he unpacks the scripture readings for that Sunday and brings them all together so you can better understand and defend the faith. Visit SundayCatholicWord.com to subscribe. That's SundayCatholicWord.com. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin's our guest, and that's an awful good thing because the topic is Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin today. And here's one we're working on. We're working our way through a question from Anonymous, who gave us the scenario. Say a group of lay people were stranded on an island, as in the TV show Lost. Could one of them, maybe a seminarian who had crashed with them, just assume the role of a priest, just declare himself a priest and perform the sacraments, and then was asking about, well, what about the sacrament of baptism? And Jimmy, you were in the midst of answering, but do you want me to give you the next?
No, I was done with answering that one.
Yeah. Okay. So you want the. So then they asked, could the unbaptized person be saved through perfect contrition? And you said, yeah, but anybody can baptize. You don't need the priest for that. And then this is the next question. I don't think we got to this one. If this person married a couple who believed that the sacrament was valid, would the marriage be inadvertently valid as full knowledge and full consent is needed to commit a mortal sin?
The marriage would be valid, period. Because you don't need a priest in order to perform a marriage. The standard understanding, at least in the Western Church, is that it's the consent of the two parties to be married that makes the marriage. And consequently, if you have two people and they consent to be married, they're going to be validly married. Now, Catholics are required to get married in the church except in special circumstances. But being stranded on a desert island with no priest is one of those circumstances. If you don't have access to a priest for 30 days, then if you're not going to have access to a priest for 30 days, then you can go ahead and get married without a priest, even if you're a Catholic. So this is going to be a valid marriage one way or another. Now, because we have been discussing both baptized and unbaptized people, I should also mention, after I've mentioned that it's going to be a valid marriage, will it be a sacramental marriage or not? And the answer is, if both parties who are getting married are baptized, it will be a valid sacramental marriage. If one or both of the parties are unbaptized, it will be a valid natural marriage, but not a sacramental one.
All right, and there's still more follow-ups to this. If the answer is that the sacraments would be valid, which would surprise me, I also have a couple of follow-up questions. What would make the sacraments invalid? And if there were no men aboard the plane, could a woman fulfill this role?
So for these two sacraments, in order to invalidate them, you'd have to use either the wrong form or the wrong matter, because they're not dependent on a particular minister. In terms of if there were no men, could a woman fulfill this role? Well, she could do baptism and marriage just like anybody else. But she would not be able to fulfill the role of a priest. And thus, any additional sacraments that she wanted to perform beyond baptism and matrimony would not be valid, just like if a layman is usurping the role of a priest, any sacraments he performs beyond baptism and matrimony are not going to be valid. By the way, I also should mention, since Anonymous said in his initial scenario that that this guy was about to be ordained a priest anyway, when he was when the plane crash occurred, he's probably already a transitional deacon. Transitional deacons, what happens when you're getting ordained to the priesthood is you do all your studies and then they ordain you as a deacon. But you're not going to permanently remain in that state. So you're not a permanent deacon. Instead, they ordain you as a deacon, and then typically 6 months later, they do your priestly ordination. So you're transitioning from the lay state to the priesthood, and so you're using the diaconate as part of that transition. So you're called a transitional deacon. So if this guy was just about to get ordained as a priest, he's probably within that 6 months and would already be a transitional deacon. Now, deacons can't do any sacraments that laity are unable to do. Like laity, they can baptize people and they can officiate at matrimony as a witness, and so it wouldn't add any new abilities for him to do stuff if he was already a transitional deacon, but it would mean that he's able to do them in a more regular manner, since deacons are regularly assigned to do things of this nature. It's not as exceptional as if a layman does them.
This anonymous questioner, I just want to say thanked you in advance for taking the time, and said he knows we have lots and lots of questions, but I just wanted to tell you this part. I'm sending my love and prayers to all of you from the UK. So
thank you so much.
Yeah,
we appreciate it.
And
always great to hear from the UK.
Yeah, very much so. All right, it's Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin, and this one comes from Margie. Seeing that, and she puts this in quote, the Lord opened the mouth of Balaam's ass, and she said to Balaam, what have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times? And the ass said to Balaam, am I not your ass upon which you have ridden all your life long to this day? Was I ever accustomed to do so to you? That's Numbers chapter 22. And her question is, did Balaam's ass have a rational soul?
So rational souls are things that humans have on this planet. There may be creatures elsewhere in the universe that also have them, but animals do not have rational souls. And so Baalam's ass would not have had a rational soul. How would we read this then? Well, one possibility is due to the influence of God. The animal, even though it's not intrinsically rational, it doesn't have a soul that's intrinsically rational, it was able by grace to momentarily have a rational thought and articulate it. Another possibility is that no, its insight level remained the same, but because of God's grace, Baalam was allowed to perceive it as saying what it's reported to say to him. So it's essentially like, kind of like a vision. It could be a physical vision where God animated the animal's speech centers in such a way that it could articulate this, or it could just be that Baalam had a more visionary experience. But this would be a way of divinely accommodating what the animal was thinking without language in a linguistic form, so that Baalam could understand it. And this is kind of like, dogs. I mean, they have the ability. Most of us today are not overly familiar with asses because we don't live on a farm and we don't use asses for transportation the way they did. But a lot of people do have dogs, and various dog breeds are quite intelligent, and they're able to do things like get mad at their owners. I was talking with one of my neighbors, and he indicated that they had to, because the dog was doing something dangerous, they had to like grab the dog and prevent it from doing this dangerous thing. And the dog got mad at them and stayed mad at them for a while because it didn't understand why they were suddenly restricting its freedom. And the dog didn't realize this is for its own protection. And so we do have situations where animals, like dogs, can get mad at their owners, and they're not able to articulate why they're mad because they don't have the faculty of speech, but they are able to experience the thought, you did something wrong to me. You shouldn't have done that. And so that may be what was going on in the head of Baalam's ass. She may have, got mad because he was beating her to try to get her to go forward, even though that she can see there's an angel in the road in front of them. And she's getting mad for, look, dude, I'm trying to protect you. Why are you beating me? Why would you do this? We have this long-standing relationship, and I'm trying to help you out. What's the justification for this? And she's angry about that. She doesn't have the ability naturally to articulate all of that, but either through a momentary miracle that elevated her level of articulation, or through a momentary miracle that let Baalam perceive what she's thinking in linguistic terms so he could understand it. This experience allowed him, at least the way it's presented in the text, this experience allowed him to understand what the ass's concern was.
Thank you, Margie, very, very much for that question. Do you ever have a dog, Jimmy, where it looks like it wants to talk to you? Like you just swear that dog is about to say something, but thus far, none of mine have, but they look like they want to sometimes. Like they just got that look on their face like, I'm about to explain something to you.
Dogs are able to understand a considerable amount of human language. Now, they don't understand it all, but they can recognize words and they can figure things out. Border collies, for example, are one of the most most intelligent dog breeds, and some of them can memorize 1,000 words in English. I saw a video about a border collie that had memorized the names of like 1,000 different toys, and its owner could say, go get Glinda the Good Witch, and it'll bring the right toy out of these 1,000 toys.
Yeah.
And it was even able to use process of elimination. So what they did was they put a new toy that it didn't know the name of. I'm going to call the new toy Bob. They put this new toy in its pile of toys in another room so it can't see what they're doing. And then they would say, go get Bob. and the dog would go in and it would look around and it would be confused. And they had to say it a few times. So the dog went back and forth a few times. But eventually the dog figured out the new toy I don't know, that one must be named
That's
Bob.
amazing.
And it brought the Bob toy back. And so it was using process of elimination to deduce the name of this object that it had never seen before. And it wouldn't surprise me at all that there are situations where dogs understand what we're saying and they want to say something back to us, but they just don't have this kind of speech track
right
that would enable them to say the word. So all that comes out is woof.
Or
yeah.
All right, we'll take a quick break. Right back with more weird questions for Jimmy Akin right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
This is Archbishop Paul Coakley of the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, and you're listening to Catholic Answers Live.
Who was the first Catholic in your family? Were they evangelized by a friend, a coworker, a stranger? Did you ever think that you could be that person that God uses to save a soul? And that soul could save their family, their grandchildren, and generations to come. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we train, equip, and mobilize Catholic disciples to do the urgent work of evangelization. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
EWTN offers listeners and viewers the daily readings to enable you to accompany the Mass of the day. Our Catholic daily readings include the readings of the day, along with online videos. It's a great resource for all who desire to live a life of faith that is pleasing to our Lord. Visit EWTN.com and click Catholicism. EWTN, the Global Catholic Network.
Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. There's some bear that stands on his back feet. I think it's in China. Did you see this, Jan? And there's a thing on the internet about people are convinced it's a man in a bear suit, but it's just a bear that learned people habits. Have you haven't seen that one?
I haven't seen that, but bears do stand and can even walk on their hind legs.
Yeah.
I did see a video a number of years ago called Standing Cat, which was a cat. It was standing like on the back of a sofa on its hind legs, and it's standing, it's just looking around. And so I did a blog post where I included the video, and I did a blog post that was titled something like "Everything You Need to Know About Standing Cat."
Oh, nice!
And it got a ton of views because Standing Cat, what's that?
Well, so this bear, it's some kind of it's a sun bear, and it does look freakishly human. Like it waves and does all this weird stuff, but it's a bear. All right, Patrick. It's weird questions with Jimmy Akin this hour, and this one comes from Patrick. Patrick asks, was it certain or contingent that Adam and Eve would fall, or that the angels would fall?
So, in contrasting certain and contingent, Patrick means like, was it fated that this had to happen, or was it contingent on the free will decisions of the human or angels? And in both cases, the answer is the same. It was contingent. Humans fell because they misused their free will, and before that, angels fell, and maybe even after that too, angels fell because of their misuse of free will. However, God in both cases had foreknowledge that it would happen, but knowing something is going to happen doesn't mean you cause it to happen. It's not fated. So if I can tell, for example, and I've used this example before, if it's dinner time and I put a slice of pizza in front of Cy Kellett,
you know what's going to happen.
I have foreknowledge of what's going to happen, but that doesn't mean he's not doing it by free will.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay. I'm sorry. I started thinking about pizza, and then I lost my train of thought for a second. All right. So then Patrick goes on to ask these questions. If it is certain, could God create other rational beings for whom their fall would be contingent, and could they potentially persist and perpetually in the state of grace and obedience to God?
Yes, God can. A fall will be contingent for anybody who has free will such that they can choose between good and evil. And if they have free will such that they can choose between good and evil, they may consistently choose good. So they may not fall and may remain in a state of original righteousness perpetually.
And then he says, if it is contingent, could another human couple, same nature, different identity, have persisted in the state of grace and obedience to God perpetually in the Garden of Eden?
So if God had created additional couples, and we're not going to get into the science question of exactly how many couples were at the start of the human race, but if there were multiple couples and they were all created in a state of original righteousness, and one couple, Adam and Eve, fell, then the others would or would not have remained in a state of grace, depending on whether Adam and Eve were what are known as the federal heads of the human race. The idea of federal headship is there is an individual or a pair of individuals, or there's some people who are the heads of the race, such that if something happens to them, it has ripple effects on everybody else in the race. So if Adam and Eve lose sanctifying grace, then they would, if they were federal heads, they would lose it for everybody else in the human race too, not just later humans, but contemporary humans as well, who existed alongside them. On the other hand, if Adam and Eve are not the federal heads of the human race in the sense just described, then their fall would affect only them. They would lose sanctifying grace. Other people would remain in sanctifying grace, or in original righteousness, I should say, as long as they didn't choose to follow Adam and Eve's example by sinning.
All right. And then he asks for the angels. If they transcend space and time, how do we understand before and after, in heaven and not in heaven, with respect to their fall?
Church teaching is actually that all created beings, you can find this in John Paul II. He discusses this in his audiences. Church teaching is that all created beings, which includes angels, are bound by space and time, are bound by time. And so it's only God that is truly outside of time and truly eternal in the proper sense. Everything else is subject to time. So angels have before and after. There is a time before angels fell and a time after angels fell. And they may not experience time the way we do. And there has been speculation, for example, among medieval theologians about how they experience time. That's all in the realm. That's not a matter of church teaching. It's all speculation. But it is agreed that they are subject to sequentiality and thus time in some sense, although they may perceive it differently than we do, sort of the way that various creatures here on Earth perceive time at different rates. A sloth perceives time at a slower rate than a human. They just don't think as fast. So, but a housefly experiences time at a faster rate than a human, which is why they're so hard to hit with a fly swatter, because they're thinking faster than we are, and they get ready to move. So angels may perceive time differently. They still go through it, but they may experience it differently than we do, just like some earthly creatures do. With respect to them being in heaven or not in heaven, well, so Pat asks, how do we understand in heaven and not in heaven with respect to their fall? Well, you could understand it sort of spiritually, geographically, as if heaven is a distinct place in the invisible world, and as long as they didn't sin, they were allowed in this space, and then after they sinned, they were kicked out of this space. So that's a possible understanding, a spatial understanding of heaven, even if it's not located in our universe. But it's also possible to understand heaven as a condition, where if you are in a state of original righteousness or sanctifying grace, you are in spiritual union with God. And if you're in full spiritual union with God, then you could be described as being in heaven. And if you then fall out of righteousness and grace, you would fall out of the state of being in full spiritual union with God. And so this would be more of a relational understanding of heaven, because your relationship with God changes depending on your degree of union with Him. And so the angels that were in original righteousness would have been in full union with God. And then when they sinned, they lost full union with God. And we could describe that as them either being in heaven or not being in heaven based on their relationship to God, rather than their location in a spatial realm of some kind.
All right. Patrick, thank you very much for those questions. It's Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin, and we've got a lot of really interesting ones. This one comes from Jacob. Suppose Middle Earth really existed. Could God become incarnate as a man, an elf, a dwarf, and a hobbit all at the same time? If yes, could man, elf, dwarf, and hobbit Jesus interact with each other and maybe all go out for a pint?
Okay, so this will come now. There's no church teaching on this, but I think the answer is pretty straightforward. And a lot of people would be surprised to learn this, but Thomas Aquinas, he didn't use Middle Earth as an example, but he did address questions like, could Christ incarnate more than once at the same time? And could the Father and the Holy Spirit also incarnate in multiple bodies? And could they take on different natures? And so they don't all have to be human. And could they all incarnate as this in the same body? And when it comes to the last question, the answer is, well, they can't all be hypostatically united to that one body, but they could all be active in the one body. When it comes to the other questions, like could any person of the Trinity incarnate multiple times in different bodies at the same time and of different natures, the answer is yes. And I think Aquinas is right on this one, because if it's possible, God can do anything logically possible. That's what omnipotence is. And if it's logically possible for Christ for the Son to incarnate as a human and take on this additional nature, then that reveals there's no contradiction if you say the Son incarnates with one human nature. Well, it doesn't add a logical contradiction if you say the Son incarnates in 2 human natures or 3 human natures or 5,000 human natures. And so he could incarnate in multiple natures. And since I didn't say anything in those statements about time, they could all happen at the same time. And Aquinas would say, and I think he's right, if God can unite his divine nature to a human nature, he can unite it to any nature he wants. And so consequently, he could, if there was such a thing as an elf nature and a dwarf nature and a hobbit nature, although hobbits, I think, are really supposed to be a species of human, but I could be mistaken. If there are these multiple natures, well, there's no reason he can't unite himself to them. So the answer is yes. He could, if Middle Earth was real, the Son could, by his divine omnipotence, assume each one of these natures. And if he assumed them all living in the same time period, well, there's no logical contradiction in saying these people go down to a pub and have a pint together. So omnipotence would allow interactions between his different incarnations.
Wow.
That's probably one of the weirder questions today.
Yeah, that's pretty weird. Yeah. So I just want to clarify one thing. Did I understand? Did you that God could be united to any nature, or it had to be a rational nature? Did you say? I missed.
I didn't say anything about that.
Okay.
Because if God can unite himself to a rational nature, he could unite his essence, his divine nature, to any created nature. Kind of like I could stick my hand in a glove. The glove doesn't have to be intelligent.
Right, right. It's also fascinating to think that Thomas Aquinas dealt with it, not the Middle Earth part, but with the in the general,
principles.
in the
Yeah.
principle of the question. Jacob, thank you. You gave us a really weird one to end that hour on, but we're not done. We got more weirdness to come. There's another hour of Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin will be back for another hour. And we will continue with weird questions. And we'll get a little bit more of that weird question music that I like so much as well. Don't forget, all this weekend, you can get $10 books over at shop.catholic.com. We've got the $10 book category, and there's 35 of them. Some of them new, some of them classics and bestsellers. Just go to shop.catholic.com and look for the Book Lovers $10 sale. All right, we'll take a quick break. Right back with more weird questions for Jimmy Akin right after this. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin's our guest this hour. I'm Cy Kellett, your host, and it's Weird Questions for Jimmy Akin. And boy, do we have a lot of weird questions. Jimmy deals with a lot of weird stuff over at Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, too, and I believe I forgot to ask you about that. How's everything going at Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World?
Oh, the mysterious world continues to turn.
The mysteries continue.
Yeah, no shortage of them.
Now, I know there's no shortage of them, but how often do you find a new one where you go, oh, that might go on the list?
Oh, that happens, I don't know, pretty regularly. People send in suggestions, although most of the ones they suggest are already on the list.
Yeah.
And I run across ones myself in my own reading and research and think, oh, this would make a good episode. It just depends. But currently there's, I think, over 2,000 mysteries on the big list. And we've only gotten to a little under 300 of them so far.
Wow. Well, yeah, if you've got a list of 2,000, someone would have to really find something special for it not to have been on that list.
Yeah, at least of the kinds of mysteries that we do.
Yeah. You can find out Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World at mysterious.fm. And this week is the second part, right, of a priest who helps stuck souls.
Yes. So last week I interviewed Father Nathan Castle of the Dominican Order about a ministry he has. He reports he gets dreams from people who died in various ways, and then he interprets these dreams as a call for help on the part of the soul as it's in its purgation process, as in its journey to God. And he and a prayer partner contact the soul and give it a kind of counseling, and they pray for the soul and help it move on in its journey to God. And so last week I interviewed him and we talked about what he does. And this week I go into analysis mode and from the usual perspectives of faith and reason, and say, what could we discern about this based on reason, and what could we discern about it based on the teaching of the faith? In particular, since he contacts the spirits, what are the dynamics of talking to dead folks? How does that work? Because a lot of people think, especially in the Protestant community, think you could just never talk to dead people. But that's not the Catholic perspective. And there's more flexibility here than a lot of people realize. And so I explore that question in depth, into just what is permitted here. And there's more that's permitted than you would think. It's not unlimited. There are limits, but there's a lot more than you'd think. So I talk about that, and that's today's episode. So that's already out. Next Friday is the 5th anniversary of the show. And for the 5th anniversary, I have learned over the years that many people in the audience have had mysterious experiences. And since I've been studying parapsychology, I've now been trained in how to analyze mysterious experiences. And so I said, let's do that for our 5th anniversary. We put out a couple of, and there have even been parapsychological studies of mysterious experiences. And I'm following in that tradition. We put out a couple of calls, just 2, for people to send in their mysterious experiences. And even though we only asked for them twice, they sent in video and audio recordings where they're talking about their mysterious experiences, and just the ones where they wrote it in, like by email. When I put them all in one document, it was 80 pages of single-spaced text.
Wow. This is a mysterious world.
Yeah, they had lots of mysterious experiences, so I selected some. I'm saving the rest for the future. But I selected some, and we present them in next Friday's episode, and then I offer commentary. I mean, with one exception, I didn't actually do an investigation of the experience, but just hearing the experience described, I can say, well, here's what category it would go into, and here's what you'd want to watch out for in terms of, could this have a natural cause? But if it has a non-natural cause, this is what it sounds like.
How cool. That's fun. 5th anniversary. Wow. Congratulations on 5 years.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that, and at a pace of one a week, you're over
little more than one a week.
A little more than one a week. All right. So you're coming up on 300, or where are you now?
Yeah, we're getting up to 300.
Wow.
We're at like 271 is next week's episode.
Hey, if you haven't listened to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, it's one of the most popular documentary podcasts on the internets, and you can just go to mysterious.fm and check it out. or just type in Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. I've done it many times, and it does take you where you're going. Let's get a weird question for Jimmy. Here's a weird one. This is from an anonymous questioner. I'm a bit of a survivalist nut, and I'm always preparing for the collapse of civilization. What could give you the idea that this civilization would collapse? I can't imagine.
Maybe all the previous ones collapsed?
Yeah, or the current condition of this one. I was just wondering, if there was a nuclear war or really any kind of catastrophe that would trigger a societal collapse, and the chaos was so widespread that most of the bishops and all of the cardinals were killed, how would the new pope be elected? Could the surviving bishops, who I would imagine would be cardinals because most likely they'd be remote rural bishops, elect the new pope? Oh, would not be cardinals, I beg your pardon, because they would be remote rural bishops. Could they elect a new pope? Furthermore, what if the bishops were killed? Could regular priests somehow advance one of their own to the bishopric? If not, could they at least lay their hands on lay people and continue apostolic succession that way?
Okay, so first thing, there might be some cardinals that would, bishops who are cardinals that would survive. Pope Francis is concerned about the church being overly centralized in Europe and in the developed world. And he recently appointed a cardinal from Mongolia, which is rural and has almost no Catholics. So, but since we've specified in the scenario that all the cardinals are gone, what would happen? Well, we're dealing with a situation, to use a fancy Latin term for it, that is praeter legem. Praeter legem means apart from the law. It is something the law does not provide for. Because if you look at the church's current law regarding how you elect a pope, it needs to be the cardinals who do it. But so if you have a situation where there are no cardinals to do it, you're dealing with a situation that the law does not provide for and is therefore praeter legem. But you're not bound to the law if the law is impossible to fulfill. So if a law is impossible to fulfill, then you can do what you need to do under what's known in legal circles as a necessity defense. You know, like if the speed limit in your town, let's say in a particular zone, is 30 miles an hour. But if you're in a car with someone who's having a heart attack, you can drive faster than 30 miles an hour to get them to the hospital. So you have what's known as a necessity defense. You're in a situation that the law does not provide for, and you're able to do what is necessary. And so the same thing would happen in this situation. Even though the way the law is currently written, it requires the College of Cardinals to elect a new pope. In an emergency situation where there's a necessity, we got to elect a new pope and there are no cardinals to do it, there would be solutions. Now, one solution that's possible would be the bishops who survive could appoint new cardinals. Maybe, even though now you have to be appointed by the Pope, if there's no Pope and you need cardinals, well, then the bishops could do it. Or the bishops could hold a council and elect one of their own. So and then the new Pope could appoint new cardinals. But one way or another, it would be the bishops who would come up with the new Pope, either directly through a meeting and it wouldn't have to be a physical meeting. It could be an online meeting. But they would be the ones to come up with the new Pope, either through a meeting of all of the body of bishops or by designating some of them to as cardinals or with some other term to be the ones to elect the new Pope. So that's what would happen, assuming we have no cardinals but surviving bishops. What if all the bishops were killed? Well, the next thing that Anonymous asks is, could regular priests somehow advance one of their own to the episcopacy? And the answer is maybe. One of the things that exists in Catholic tradition is there have been situations where priests had permission from the Pope to ordain someone else to the priesthood. And that would suggest that the power so you have that has happened in some cases. It's happened, for example, in remote abbeys where the abbot, who's the head of the abbey, is a priest, and it's remote, and so there aren't any nearby bishops to ordain new priests in the abbey, and the abbot has gotten permission from the Pope to ordain one of his brothers a priest. And so that's happened in some circumstances, but it is not universally agreed upon that this is possible. So you have a diversity of opinion on this question. Based on historical practice, I would say this is an open question. Today, the ordination of men is reserved exclusively to bishops, but that hasn't been the case in all places in history. And so I would say there's two possible opinions here. Either these cases resulted in invalid ordinations and they just didn't realize they were going to be invalid, or these cases illustrate that it's possible for a priest to validly ordain. So if that's the case, then priests could come up with new priests and maybe bishops, because there's a question about how the office of the episcopacy developed. One of the things you find when you look in the New Testament is originally the terms for priest, and the Greek term there that's relevant in a Christian context is presbyteros. It means elder. And the office of bishop or episkopos, overseer, they're originally identical. The terms were used, both terms were used for the same office. And you can see that in St. Paul's pastoral epistles that were written in the AD 60s. And then by the beginning of the 2nd century, so when you have Ignatius of Antioch writing around 108 AD, you have a differentiation that's occurred, where now there's typically one person in a local church who is regarded as the episkopos, as the bishop, and he's got a group of presbyteroi, or priests, who report to him. And the question is, well, how did this transition occur? Now, it occurred at the end of the apostolic age, between the AD 60s and the AD 100s. And so presumably the surviving apostles had some role in this transition, but it's everywhere at the beginning of the 2nd century. And one of the most common interpretations of what happened is that you originally had a body of presbyters who were also called overseers or bishops. That's what the term bishop means in Greek, of the congregation. And then, because groups need leaders, you got a group of 5 or 10 guys who are all presbyters. Well, they're going to need a leader. So one of them is going to end up as, he's like the guy who oversees our group. He's the president of our group. He's the chief priest, and so forth. And that priest, because the term overseer, episkopos, sounds higher than if you're overseeing, well, that's a higher sounding term than elder. And so the chief priest in every church became known as the overseer or the bishop. And that's a very plausible reconstruction of the transition that happened. It leaves open a question, though, of, so is a bishop just a priest with special faculties, or is there a sacramental difference? And this was an open question for a huge chunk of church history. In fact, you'll have church fathers and doctors of the church like St. Augustine saying, yeah, basically bishops are the same thing as priests. They just have greater jurisdiction. They have more legal rights in what they can do. But sacramentally, there's no difference. Now, that issue got revisited very recently at the Second Vatican Council. And so at the Second Vatican Council, the Council Fathers chose for the first time to actually teach that there's some kind of sacramental difference between a bishop and a priest. The text, though, of what they say the fullness of the sacrament of orders is attained with the episcopacy. So that implies that priests don't have quite the fullness of it. But they phrase themselves in such a way at the council that I know theologians who say that you can read the text without it requiring a fundamental sacramental difference between bishop and priest. And so if all that's the case, if priests are capable of ordination based on various traditions, various historical incidents in the past, and if the bishopric evolved out of the priesthood, and if there's not a fundamental radical difference between the two offices, then it could be possible for priests to come up with a new bishop and elevate one of their own number to the episcopacy. That's all speculation, though. None of what I just said is certain, but there is, in this weird scenario where all of the bishops get killed somehow, and I don't foresee that happening, because it's if the human race survives, it's going to contain some bishops. But even if all of the bishops were killed, there is a plausible scenario that you can build from church history that would allow priests to come up with a new episcopacy that would be valid and thus able to continue apostolic succession and the sacraments and everything like that.
Anonymous, what a great question. Thanks very, very much. It fits the category of weird question perfectly, and we've got more weird questions for Jimmy Akin right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Miss a show? Make sure to catch up by downloading the podcast, available online at Catholic.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
This is Conversations with Consequences, where we delve deeper into issues affecting our church, our country, and our core, the family.
As Catholics, we need to be informed, aware, and able to talk through some of the tough topics that we're facing in our culture and in our world. Conversations with Consequences gives us the tools to do so.
It's not enough to pray. We have to be a light for the world.
Conversations with Consequences, tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. Jimmy Akin, our guest, and it's Weird Questions for Jimmy Akin on this Friday afternoon. And thanks again to everybody who helped us out over the last few days during our pledge drive. We don't have the final number, but I can tell you that the third day was an extraordinary day and one that really lifted spirits around here, and I just want to thank you for that. I know many people prayed for the success of our pledge drive, and many people contributed to the success financially of our pledge drive, and we're grateful for all of it, and just really grateful that there are so many people who are willing to be partners with us in this effort here at Catholic Answers. So next week we'll have better numbers, but we know we're in the ballpark. We just don't know exactly where we're going to land, because we have to see what, certain checks and things come in later, and we'll see. But thank you again for your help and your support. Weird questions. People get to ask Jimmy all kinds of weird things, and we love it, and it's a lot of fun. And if you've got a weird question, if you think, I'd like to ask Jimmy a weird question, you can, if you're in contact with Jimmy in one of his social media places, you might do it there. But an easy way to do it is just send it to radio@catholic.com, our website here in the radio department, and we'll make sure Jimmy gets it. radio@catholic.com. The next question for Jimmy comes from Martin, and Martin says, when the Magi came, do you think it made the Holy Family wealthy enough to travel and stay in Egypt, provide for a 3-year ministry of 13 plus, and care for his beloved mother Mary until the Dormition?
No, I don't. We're told that the Magi gave 3 valuable gifts to the Holy Family: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And that would have improved their financial condition temporarily. But I think we have quite good evidence that it didn't make them rich because of 2 things. First, Jesus and his father Joseph were manual laborers, and they're both the word tecton is used to refer to them, and that's often translated carpenter. It can refer to not exactly what we think of as a carpenter. It can refer to that, but it can also refer to builders and other people who work with their hands. But so at least we can say they were both manual laborers while Jesus was growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And that means they were not rich aristocrats while Jesus was growing up. Also, Luke, and this is at the beginning of Luke chapter 8, he tells us that during the ministry of Christ, when he's going around in Galilee and preaching, a whole bunch of women traveled with them, and Luke names some of the women, and he says, and they ministered. It's going to be a little different in different translations, but it says that these women ministered to Jesus out of their substance, meaning they supported him with their money. And so he was actively receiving donations to support his ministry, his traveling ministry with the 12. And so he did not have lots of financial resources. Also, now that I think about it, there's a third reason to say Jesus wasn't wealthy, which is the band of the 12 kept all of its money in one bag that Judas was the keeper of. And so at least that would suggest that they again, with these other pieces of data, they weren't rich. And so I would say that even though the valuable gifts that the Magi gave did have an impact on the Holy Family's finances, it wasn't such that it set the Holy Family up for life as rich people. I would suspect that what happened to those gifts is they all got used during the sojourn in Egypt, because they had to travel, they had to find a new place to live, they had to undoubtedly bribe people because bribery was a standard part of the culture. They had to then travel back, and we don't have any indication that they were rich while Jesus was growing up. So my theory would be that those gifts, or at least the bulk of them, were used up by the trip to Egypt and back. They may have had a little more, but it didn't last till Jesus' adulthood.
Martin, thank you. Thanks very much for that question. It's Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin this hour. And Joe has this one. Are the laws of logic and thought, identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle, true of all possible universes or only of ours? Would multiverse theories or alternate dimensions modify these rules? And do the laws certainly apply even here, or could one argue that maybe an extreme form of scotistic haesiety versus
hexaity?
Hexaity. Okay, I always have trouble with that one. Versus quiddity mean that maybe they don't.
Okay, so you will find some Catholic sources that talk about laws of logic and thought, and that discussion is useful, but I tend to come at it from a somewhat different perspective, from a more philosophical perspective. One of the things that this kind of categorization tends to be, one characteristic of this kind of categorization is that it's based on older scholarship. You'll find it going back quite a ways, and it has the authors who use this categorization scheme tend not to be up on modern developments in logic. Now, there are things like the law of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle and so forth that you will find in logic, but you'll find a lot more than that. And you also typically won't find academic philosophers outside of some very narrow Catholic circles discussing laws of thought. I would want to know more about, so exactly how are we conceptualizing this? Because I know that, well, I won't go too far down that road, but I think that this is a somewhat simplistic categorization system. And so if Joe is interested in reading about this, I would suggest he read more broadly, check out some recent work that has been done on logic and metaphysics, and not simply what is found in older Catholic philosophical works or older Catholic apologetics works, because there's a lot more on this. Having said all that, I think that if something is genuinely a law of logic, it's going to apply to all universes, because God's omnipotence is the ability to do anything that is logically possible. And therefore, the laws of logic are related to God's ability to create stuff. And since God creates worlds, every world is going to obey the same set of laws of logic. However, there may be things about the laws of logic we haven't yet noticed. And so there may be different applications of them in different universes that could be surprising to us.
Right back with more Weird Questions. Are you ready to defend your faith in a world of unbelief? Join us at the 9th Annual Catholic Answers Apologetics Conference. This year's theme, I Believe in God, and it'll help you provide clear and charitable answers to atheism, agnosticism, and plain old indifference. Don't miss what promises to be the event of the season. Join us in San Diego from September 21st through 24th as we welcome our special guest, Dr. Scott Hahn, and an all-star lineup of great Catholic speakers. Spend quality time with your favorite Catholic Answers apologists and enjoy 4 days of fun, fellowship, and adoration of the Almighty. Seats are still available, but they're going fast. Visit CatholicAnswersConference.com or call 888-291-8000 to register. Enter promo code EARLY and save $50. That's CatholicAnswersConference.com.
Want to know more about the origins of the Catholic Church? Joe Heschmeyer explores the beginnings of Christianity. In the early church was the Catholic Church. Joe digs deep into the words and actions of those who lived right after the apostles to refute anti-Catholic claims of how the faith was lived back then. Order your copy of The Early Church Was the Catholic Church today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers monthly giving club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. We're having a good Friday afternoon here, taking weird questions and getting Jimmy's answers to the weird questions. I hope you're having a good Friday afternoon. This one comes from Andy. Andy, this is a weird question. Thank you very much for it. Why is most lunch meat round when bread is mostly square?
Okay, so we need to talk about the origin, and this is a fair question. This is weird questions, not weird religious questions, and I answer non-religious questions on other shows, so this is just one of them. And it is weird that most lunch meat is round and most bread is square. So why is that? Well, first we should talk about the origins of the components of a sandwich. If you have most lunch meat is essentially, it's a version of sausage, and sausages, whether it's salami or bologna or, liverwurst or whatever it is, it's kind of sausage. Now, the bread that sandwiches are made out of also, it does not go back hugely far in history. If you were to go back to the time of Jesus, you would have bread, but it wouldn't look anything like our modern square bread.
Oh, right,
It would be flat bread, and you might have some little round loaves like pitas, but you wouldn't have the modern sort of rectangular loaf that we have today and that we then cut up to make slices of bread. So why do these two different things have? And I should mention, sandwiches don't go back all that far in history. They're actually credited to a gentleman named John Montague, who was an Englishman, and he was an earl in England. He was a nobleman, and he was the 4th Earl of Sandwich. And that's why sandwiches are called sandwiches, because they were allegedly created by the 4th Earl of Sandwich. And allegedly, he created them because he, like a lot of people in this time, a lot of rich people in this time, was big into gambling. And so he would be playing cards, and he wouldn't want to quit the game to have a 7-course meal. So what he would do instead is just tell his servants, cut up some sausage and stick it between pieces of bread so I'll keep my fingers clean and I'll eat that. And that's how we got sandwiches, at least according to the story. So why are sausages round? Which tells us why most lunch meat is round. It's because of the way they made it. Sausage is made out of the innards of out of the flesh of an animal, and sometimes other parts of an animal, and they would grind it up. And so you'd have this ground up animal flesh and other stuff. And then they would need but it's just a goop at this point. You need something to give it a shape. And they didn't want to waste parts of animals. And so back in the day, even today, you can find whole hog sausages where they basically grind up the whole body, maybe minus the bones, but it's everything else that gets ground up. They also say, don't ask how the sausage is made, but I need to explain at least part of that in order to answer this question. So what do they use to give the sausage, the ground up meat, a shape to turn it into a sausage? The answer is they used intestines, because after they had slaughtered the animal, they had all these parts of the animal they needed to use, and one of those parts was the intestines. And so what they would do is they would take the ground up sausage material and shove it into an intestine. They, of course, cleaned the intestine first, but then they would shove it into the intestine and use the intestine as a casing. And then they would seal off both ends, and both ends would be pointed where they had sealed it and also kind of wrinkled, which is why you see wrinkling on the ends of some sausages if you see an uncut sausage. And I don't know that these days they're not all necessarily intestinal casings, but this is how it started. Well, intestines are tubes. And what happens if you then slice a tube to make luncheon meat out of it, you end up with a circle or a basically circular shape. So that's why luncheon meat is round, for the most part, because historically, it is a form of sausage, and historically sausages were made with round intestinal casings. What about bread? Well, in bread, you've got something similar. You grind up wheat and you add water and maybe other things like eggs and milk and stuff to it, and you end up with a goop, which we call dough. And you can, roll out the dough so it's flat and make flatbread. But if you don't want flatbread, you're going to need a container to put it in. Well, I guess you could put the bread goop, the dough, into an intestine, but I don't think that would survive the baking process well. It would be better if you had a container that was made out of metal or ceramic. And because metal and ceramic, it survive intense heat better. And so what would happen is they would make containers to put the bread goop in, the dough in, that were made of metal or ceramics. And because the most efficient space-filling shape is a square or a rectangle, they made rectangular bread pans. Because you can stack those up and put them in your cabinet, and it uses the dough efficiently. It makes a good shape because you can set your rectangular loaf of bread down on a table for purposes of slicing it. And when you slice a rectangle, you get a square. And so that's why bread tends to be square, or at least modern bread tends to be square. Incidentally, as I mentioned on the show before, originally you had to do your own bread slicing. But in 1928, something very special happened. New technology allowed bakers to pre-slice the bread for you so that you would buy a package. Instead of just buying a loaf of bread that you had to cut up yourself, you could buy a package that had a loaf in it that was pre-sliced. So all those housewives didn't have to cut the bread manually anymore. Sliced bread was the latest, greatest thing. And that's why we have the expression, the greatest thing since sliced bread, which was introduced in 1928. They tried to ban it during World War II because they said this is a luxury we can live without. Not according to all the housewives who previously had to slice bread. And the effort to ban sliced bread during wartime failed because having the pre-sliced bread was so useful for housewives. So that's the basic story on why most lunch meat is round and why most bread is square. It's because most lunch meat is sausage, and sausage was historically made using intestines as casings, and intestines are round. And because bread today is made using bread pans of metal or ceramic, and they're made rectangular because the rectangle is the best space-filling shape, and therefore it's a good shape to put your bread dough in.
Andy, thank you very much for that question. That fits right in with weird questions for Jimmy Akin. The next one is from Zane. Jimmy, huge fan of your work, your terminal intellect and towering beard. And then he says, maybe I got that backwards. If we, in the eschaton, are given our infallible bodies and the New Jerusalem, in essence, becomes our planet Krypton, can you postulate on what we will do in the eschaton? Saints are generals in God's army, etc. But what will our missions be? Will we go and evangelize the universe of fallen creatures? If so, will Christ have to incarnate on that world to save them, or will we, as we have been made gods, or is that a blasphemous thing? If we do hypothetically have to incarnate for them, would our infallible bodies change to the alien form we incarnate for? Thus, we become aliens only until we go to the next world? Or if Christ can do the incarnating, saving, would be, or are there already millions of incarnations of Christ in his form in heaven, adjusted to whatever creatures he's interacting with?
Okay, so I'm not entirely sure what Zane means by the new Earth being our planet Krypton, because Krypton blew up, and God's not going to blow up our new home. He may mean it's our planet Krypton in the sense of we will effectively have superpowers once we're in our glorified bodies. And that's true. We will have superpowers once we're in our glorified bodies, because Jesus had superpowers in his glorified body, and we're told we're going to be like Jesus. In terms of what we're going to be doing, well, we are told we're going to rule and reign with Christ, and that involves activity, but we don't know what our missions are going to be. They may involve just living life here on the new renovated Earth. We may not go out into the cosmos, although we may. And if we do, we may or may not encounter life forms that need evangelizing. If we do encounter life forms that need evangelizing, then we could certainly tell them what God did for us. There would then be a question of, well, how does that apply to them? And that's something I've devoted a whole episode of Mysterious World to. It's episode 55, so you can find it by going to mysterious.fm/55 for more information on that. But basically, if we evangelize them, well, we might or might not appear in their forms. We would presumably be able to change our own forms to look like them if we chose, given our glorified bodies, and we might choose to appear in their forms to evangelize. It's kind of like the Jesuits. When the Jesuits evangelized China originally, they didn't continue to dress as Europeans because European clothing looked weird and foreign to Chinese people. So the Jesuits would wear Chinese clothes to fit in better and get a better hearing for the gospel among the Chinese people they were talking to. And in the same way, if we were evangelizing, people from another race in space, we might take on their form to do that. Could we redeem them somehow ourselves? According to St. Thomas Aquinas, the answer would be, or the principles that St. Thomas Aquinas articulates, the answer would depend on God's choice, because God, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, and St. Anselm disagrees with this, but according to St. Thomas Aquinas, God could have redeemed us in any way he chose. And if that's true, if Aquinas is right about that, and I tend to agree with Aquinas on this, then God could choose to let one of us redeem them. Do I think God is likely to choose that? No. I don't think God is likely to choose us as redeemers, even in our glorified form. I think it would be more likely for the Son, or even one of the other persons of the Holy Trinity, to redeem them, possibly the same way he redeemed us, by dying a sacrificial death. The concept of sacrifice is very deep in human nature, and it could well be very deep in the natures of other creatures too, which would make it a fitting means for redemption for them, because they would understand the concept of sacrifice, which is essentially a form of gift giving, just like we understand gift giving and sacrifice. When you give someone a gift, you've just sacrificed it to them. You don't have that thing anymore. You gave it away. And so since we understand that, I think it's likely other rational creatures would have gift-giving and sacrifice customs that would be appropriate for God to use to communicate the message of his love and redemption to them. Could Christ incarnate into these other species? Well, as we covered earlier today, according to Aquinas, yes, and I agree with Aquinas on this one. If God can incarnate, if the Son in particular can incarnate as a human, then there is no logical contradiction in the idea of incarnation. And if there's no logical contradiction in the idea of incarnation, meaning God can do it by his omnipotence, there's no logical contradiction in the idea of incarnating twice, or 3 times, or 1 billion times. And so I would agree with Aquinas. The Son could incarnate as many times as he chooses, in as many different natures as he chooses, and so could the Father and the Holy Spirit, because they're all omnipotent, so they can do what they choose as long as it doesn't involve a logical contradiction, and none of this does. Now, would he have to do those things? No. He could say, hey, I already did it once, and I paid an infinite price on that cross in Jerusalem on earth, and that paid for the whole universe. And so we could just evangelize them and baptize them, and they would be ordinary Christians like us. Or, if he chose, he could incarnate on multiple planets or do something else to provide for their salvation, or not, because this is a free act on God's part. And there could be, multiple other incarnations of God up in heaven that we simply have not been told about. That's up to God.
Hey, that's another very fine question. Thank you very much, Zane, for that. We got to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more of these weird questions we've got for Jimmy Akin right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
There's only one Catholic Answers Live.
The Catechism defines evangelization as the proclamation of Christ and his gospel by word and the testimony of life. But what does that look like in real life? It looks like St. Paul street evangelists out in the public square sharing the good news. We're a Catholic nonprofit that starts conversations by handing out free sacramentals. Then we employ our method of listen, befriend, proclaim, and invite. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to learn more.
If it's central to the faith, you can find it on EWTN Podcast Central, featuring the best of EWTN radio, as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates across the nation, all in one place, all free. The destination for great Catholic audio programming is EWTN Podcast Central. It's like podcast heaven. Visit EWTN.com/radio/podcasts today.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. There's the weird music for Weird Questions with Jimmy Akin. That's what we're doing this afternoon. We're glad you're here with us. Got a few more weird questions we can get to before we have to finish this hour, and this one comes from Chris. Jimmy, Chris wants to know, why did humans take so long to be advanced just recently with agriculture, medicine, economy, infrastructure, etc.? What were they doing for 200,000 years?
They were trying to survive, and surviving wasn't easy in a pre-technological environment. As a result, that's what they were doing most of the time. They were living hand to mouth, and they didn't have they had so much of their time devoted to just trying to survive that they didn't have a lot of other time for research that would help them develop technology. Nobody had the idea of technology at the time. And so they weren't working toward it. They were just, well, this is how we live. This is how you hunt a bison, or this is how you hunt a mammoth. And these are the kind of plants that are local, that are safe to eat. And we're going to roam around our territory as hunter-gatherers and collect food and eat it. And that's all they were trying to do. They weren't working towards a goal of how can we improve the world, because they're concerned about their own family and their own family's survival. And that's about it. So that's part of it. Now, there are other parts of why they didn't progress faster as well. One of them is there has been a change in the level of human intellect. Humans navigate a very complex culture. A lot of times, it's been noted, let me put it this way. When an organism encounters a difficulty, it puts pressure on certain genes that will, and this is known as selection pressure, that will cause those genes to replicate in a population. And if the genes do not have selection pressure on them, they will tend to degrade and disappear from the population. So, for example, let's suppose you're a lion, and your ability to survive involves having sharp teeth and sharp claws. Well, that's going to put selection pressure on the teeth and claw genes that will encourage sharpness. And so lions that have sharp teeth and sharp claws will survive. Lions that have duller teeth and duller claws will not survive as much. And so, as a result, the sharp teeth, sharp claw genes will come to predominate in lion society, because lions depend on their teeth and claws a lot. Well, humans don't have sharp teeth and sharp claws. So what do we depend on? Primarily our intellects. We also depend on other things like thumbs and tongues, which allow us to communicate. But essentially, we survive based on our intellect, because we're not the most fearsome, fastest creatures ever. And so we evolved to be the smartest. And intelligence is our survival strategy. And so that puts selection pressure on our intelligence genes. Now, various things can do that. The need to find food, the need to hunt animals, the need to fend off other groups of humans that are our opponents. So warfare puts selection pressure on our intelligence genes. And we have an incredibly complex social society. And people who navigate that society cleverly will tend to survive and reproduce better. And so that's going to, again, the complexity of human society is going to put more selection pressure on our intelligence genes. And so over a period of tens of thousands of years, you're going to have smarter and smarter people, because of the selection pressure of navigating human society and surviving and reproducing. So we're probably considerably smarter than our ancestors were. There's also evidence that we're more cooperative than our ancestors were. And that's why we've been able to grow bigger societies. If we had the same intelligence genes as our ancestors of 50,000 years ago, and if we had the same cantankerousness of our ancestors of 50,000 years ago, we wouldn't be able to build big technological societies. We would be in little small tribes, just because we're not very cooperative, trying to survive and just caring about our tribe. But as the level of cooperativeness goes up, you survive better and you reproduce better if you can cooperate with more people. And so today we have bigger societies, and there are advantages to all of that. One of the things that happened about 5,000 years ago, it's a little more than 5,000, is we developed writing. And this is a third major factor besides survival and intelligence. This is a third, and cooperativeness. This is another major factor in why we developed technology, is we developed writing. Because before you had writing, all knowledge had to be passed on from person to person. So if you wanted to learn what someone else knew, you had to go talk to that person. And you had to get it all in real time. So if someone has a lifetime of learning, they're never going to be able to pass that on to you because they're going to die before they do. But if they can write it down, they can preserve that knowledge and it can live on after them, and you can read it at your convenience, and it can be spread to other people. So not everybody has to go to this person while they're still alive to get what they know. And that ability to record and store knowledge allowed the development of technology, because you're not dependent on tribal lore anymore. You can keep permanent records. You don't have to keep reinventing things. When you find something that works, you can write it down, and that'll preserve it permanently as long as the record lasts. So between us developing certain basic forms of technology like agriculture that allowed us to survive more easily, and the selection pressure on our intelligence genes and our cooperativeness genes allowed us to build bigger, more complex societies, and the development of writing allowed us to preserve and improve knowledge over time. All of that reached critical mass. And you can put the critical mass point at a number of different places in history, but all of them are recent. It's that accumulation of things that allowed technology to really start taking off. And depending on what level of advancement of technology you want to talk about, that could be, the Neolithic Revolution, or the invention of writing, or the invention of modern philosophy shortly before Christ, or the invention of the scientific revolution, or the industrial age. But it's this accumulation of things that allowed rapid and accelerating technological advancement. So before we had modern intelligence, modern cooperativeness, writing, and some basic modern survival things, survival was hard, and that's just what they were working to do for a long time.
Thank you very much, Chris. Jimmy, I don't know. Do you want to take another question?
We can do the next one.
All right. Mallcat asks, with admission by the USA of UFOs, what do we think about extraterrestrial beings, souls, evangelizing, origin, etc.?
Well, we don't have an opinion on these. Different people have different opinions. The church has no teaching here. The church has no problem if intelligent aliens exist, or if intelligent aliens are visiting us. They would be other children of God that he created elsewhere. They might be naughty or nice, but they would be fundamentally other children of God. And in terms of them having souls, they would have souls because the soul is what makes you alive. In terms of evangelizing them, that would depend on whether they are fallen and need evangelizing, or whether they want to be, or whether they would benefit from being evangelized, even if they're not fallen. I have, as we mentioned earlier, a whole episode of Mysterious World on this. It's episode 55. So just go to mysterious.fm/55, and you can hear all about it.
Chris and Mallcat, thank you very, very much for those questions. Lots more questions. If you want to get in on the fun, if you've got a weird question for Jimmy Akin, if you've got something you'd like to hear the faith and reason perspective on that Jimmy brings, just send us an email with your question to radio@catholic.com.
And flag it as a weird question so we know which bucket to put it in.
Yep, and we'll put it in Jimmy's bucket. And also, if you like this stuff, you should really check out Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. We're coming up on 300 episodes after 5 years of mysteries over there. Lots of mysteries for you to enjoy. You can find that at mysterious.fm. One last thing, don't forget the $10 book sale over at shop.catholic.com this weekend. 35 different titles are on sale for $10 each at shop.catholic.com. That'll do it for us. Jimmy, thank you very, very much.
My pleasure, as always.
I really enjoyed the weirdness today. And that'll do it. As I said, we'll see you next time, God willing, right here, Catholic Answers Live.